Hello, fellow griever. You have found the Leftover Pieces Suicide Loss Conversations podcast, and I am Melissa, your host. I am with you on this journey because my 21-year-old son, Alex, died by suicide on August 7th of 2016. Since launching this podcast in late 2020, I have followed my heart and expanded the Leftover Pieces to include books and an online community where I host Zoom support groups every week. It is there, in this community, that I lead other parents who have lost a child by suicide from survival toward hope and into healing. The website is also a resource hub, a connecting point for all survivors of suicide loss. You can find me, ways to connect with me, and links to everything that I'm doing in the community on my website, theleftoverpieces.com. Know that I'm always open to suggestions and feedback. And if you know someone that I should connect with to be on the podcast, please let me know that as well. So now, I invite you to join me for real conversations, candid talk on hard topics surrounding the loss of our loved ones by suicide. I talk to other loss survivors, mental health experts, advocates, and on alternate weeks, I offer shorter solo episodes where I go down the rabbit hole to discuss things that have been on my mind or possibly parts of my journey that I feel would be beneficial to share. Every week, we explore the questions that haunt us, seek the courage to uncover the healing tools within us, and offer the comfort of a community that we all need so very much. It's true that our hearts and lives have been shattered, but come along with me, and together, let's choose to find meaning and even happiness amid the leftover pieces before us. Welcome. Hello, fellow griever, and welcome to Season 5, Episode 24 of the Leftover Pieces Suicide Loss Conversations podcast. I'm Melissa, your host, and today I'm sharing a very dynamic conversation that I had with a fellow suicide loss bereaved mom. She's also an author and a speaker, and her name is Erin. Erin and I discuss multiple things, of which the most amazing is, of course, her son Max, and bits and pieces of his life. But we also talk about life after the suicide loss of a child, and her book, which is called My Unexpected Journey, Reflections After Losing My Son to Suicide. Everyone is going to have a takeaway from this one, not just moms or parents. And Erin and I share so many of the same realities. So we talk about things like hope does come back eventually, and that time does not fix anything. It's what we do with the time that matters. But you'll also get to listen to Erin and I talk about some other things like, does she see signs? When did she first feel the nudge to write her book or start helping others? In other words, she's going to share her path to becoming a grief advocate, a grief educator, and a resource to other people like herself. We're going to discuss the vantage point that the book was written from and her intentions and hope for the book. And then as we end up, we also talk about a topic that's near and dear to both of our hearts, which is grief illiteracy, and why it's so profound and what we can do to start changing that. And then we talk about where she goes from here. It's an amazing conversation. I'm honored for the absolute worst reason I wish I never had to now call Erin a friend, and I welcome you to our conversation. Let's dive in. Hi, Erin. Welcome to the podcast. It is my honor to have you on. I'm so glad we connected. I'm honored to have you on and would love for you to introduce yourself and share with the listeners your lost story.
Oh, thank you, Melissa. I'm thrilled to be here. Well, my name is Erin Blechman, and I lost my firstborn, Max, in June of 2020 to suicide after his long battle with mental illness. And he struggled for 8 years prior to us losing him. So you might think that I would have been a little bit prepared for what was coming or what ultimately happened. But his death completely blindsided me and has been the single most devastating experience of my life. And even saying that sounds like a massive understatement. But it put me on the path to write a book about our experience. And that was, I'll get more into that in a little bit, but that was really just an evolution and a way for me to process my thoughts and feelings. And then I since have become a grief educator because I just felt like I needed some more tools in my toolbox to support grieving moms. And I also am a speaker. I have a background in corporate training, so it really made sense to kind of start those speaking gigs and talk to various organizations about my Max, about mental illness and how it impacts a family, about suicide awareness, about loss and grief and trying to navigate life after such a devastating loss, and then about hope and healing. So
Yeah.
that's in a nutshell a little bit about me.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate you being here. The very next thing I want to ask you to do is share a little bit about Max, if you would, because just a little bit you have told me or that I've read about, he seems like an incredible young man. And I know as a mom myself that talking about my son, Alex, is always something I'm eager to do. So would you honor us with sharing a little bit about Max and who he was and maybe a favorite memory or story?
Oh, absolutely. I love talking about my Max. So he was the most interesting person I've ever met. And I don't just say that because I'm his mom. He was just such an incredibly sensitive, quirky, eccentric, intelligent little guy. And I think back to when he first started to talk, he was 15 months old. So getting a glimpse into his little brain, speaking in sentences at such a young age, was so much fun. And we would have so many conversations where he just cracked me up. And one of the best memories from when he was that age is that two-year-olds tend to memorize things, either the alphabet or whatever.
Little.
Yeah. Well, Bill taught Max to memorize all of the NFL teams in their corresponding cities. So that was a great party trick. Bill would take Max around the neighborhood and he would say Buffalo and Max would say Bills, and he'd say Pittsburgh and Max would say Steelers. And he was just a funny, entertaining little guy. And he just continued to be that as he got older. His sensitivity was really apparent from a young age, continued throughout his life. He was, as a young adult, he was incredibly compassionate and really focused on social justice issues, very much an activist. He was also extremely creative. He was a drummer. He taught himself how to play the banjo. He wrote poetry, short stories, material for his stand-up comedy routines because he was a stand-up comic. And so just a really interesting, multifaceted person with a big heart and a real compassion for those less fortunate, for the underdog. And again, the most interesting person I've ever known. And I think not only are we missing out on having him gone, but I think the world is. I think the world would be a better place if he were still in it.
Yeah, I think we touched base on this a little bit off of recording, and I'm sure we will some more when we speak today and in the future. But to hear you talk about Max, there's so much of that could be me talking about Alex. And I have always said he was one of the most loving people I knew. I remember saying from a very young age, he's just one of the most loving people I know. And I'm just so glad to be his mom. I remember catching that when he was a toddler, and that giant heart of his never stopped. And I think in the end it was his undoing. Sounds like Max's as well. But these giant hearts that don't want to see anybody suffer, anybody at having arguments. Alex was the peacekeeper in the family. He just wanted everybody to get along. He didn't ever want to be a burden, all those things. And to hear about how beautiful Max's creativity was and his spark and uniqueness. We always said Alex marched to the beat of his own drum. That was our saying in our family. he was so different than most people, but in such all the best ways, right? And so to hear you say all those same things about Max, same and different, is just so touching. Thank you for sharing some of those stories. And if you have a chance to weave any more in, please feel free.
I will.
One of the questions I have for you is, when did the nudge show up to do more, to put the book together? Because you were already journaling. So maybe start at that point. When did you start journaling? Was it therapeutic led, or was that a natural inclination for you? And then when did that nudge show up to, maybe if I turn this into a book, I could help others? And then you went on to be Grief Educated. So just kind of unwind that journey for us a little bit, if you would.
Sure. So the summer that Max died, it was 2020, and it was right in the middle of COVID. So, everybody was struggling then. And so I was really, as I mentioned, completely blindsided by Max's death. And I struggled with depression. I had trouble getting out of bed. I would have sessions with my therapist and literally vomit words all over her. So it was her recommendation to journal. I have journaled off and on throughout my life. It was something I was familiar with and had helped me in the past. So I really just began to write things down to try to make sense of my thoughts and feelings. And then I started to put some of those journal entries out on social media. And I would like to say that my motivation was really pure and positive, but I was kind of tired of running into people and having them ask me how I was doing with a stricken look on their face. And in my head, I'd be thinking, well, how do you think I'm doing? My son just died. And so I wanted to just put things out there so people would know. So I put some of these raw and really vulnerable and authentic journal entries out on social media. And I don't know if it was a point in time where people just were hungry for that authenticity, but I got tremendous response, oftentimes from people that I hadn't seen or talked to in years. And I think it was through somebody's even threw the idea out to write a book. They said, you should write a book. And I thought, okay, maybe I will. And the book just sort of evolved. I shortly after starting to put these journal entries, which frankly was probably like months 2, 3, and 4, I found a woman at my church who is a graphic designer and an illustrator. She has some experience with mental illness and suicide. And so we just had this great collaboration and we started to work together. And the book just kind of evolved over time. We probably started working on it together at about the 6-month mark. And I was continuing to journal. She was starting the design process. One of the ideas that she had for the book was to use the bird as a theme, because in the days and weeks following Max's death, I kept seeing the same bird over and over. So she had the idea to kind of make the bird the theme of the book and did these 6 original illustrations of a bird that are just so beautiful and appear in pieces and parts throughout the book. And as we worked together, there were a couple of things that stuck out. One was that I read everything I could get my hands on during that first year after Max died. And some of the books were helpful, but many were not. And I was just so desperate to create a resource that I was looking for as a grieving mom. And some of the books that were helpful were just really heavy in their content. And so I wanted to create something that would balance that heavy content with some beauty. And Sarah was able to do that through these illustrations and through the layout of the book. I just think it's so beautifully designed. The journal entries are standalone, and she has these pull-out quotes. And then she displayed our family photos in sort of a scrapbook kind of way. I think it's very accessible. I think it's very digestible. And one of the things that I hear from grieving people is, oh, I can't read. I just don't have the concentration. I don't have the attention. And I always say, you can just skim it and you'll still hopefully get something out of it just by reading those pull-out quotes and looking at the illustrations and the family photos. And they come back to me afterwards and say, you were right. Thank you. And some people even say, I can't read. I haven't been able to read a book in years. And they'll come back and say they were able to read mine because they can take it in those little pieces. They can take it in those little bites because that's the way that it's designed and laid out. So that's sort of the evolution of the book. It came out, it chronicles the 18 months following Max's death. And this is just kind of an interesting tidbit. So as Sarah and I were working together, she's the designer and illustrator, she said to me, we have to decide when the book is going to end. And she suggested a year. She said, what about 12 months? Because it's laid out chronologically, the first week, the first month, and then after that, it's the next block of time, which ended up being those 18 months, that first year and a half. And when she threw out the 12-month suggestion, I said to her, oh, Sarah, we can't end the book at 12 months because I was in a very dark place at 12 months. I said it would be the most depressing book ever written. So we kept going. And at the 18-month mark, I could see my hope returning. And that's the title of that last section of book, Hoping for Hope. I didn't have my hope back, but I could see a time when I could get it back. And so that last section of my book, at that 18-month mark, I could sort of see that light at the end of the tunnel as far as my deep, dark grief went. And so anyway, it was released, the book was released in April of 2022. And almost immediately, I connected with people really from all over the world and heard their stories of loss, child loss, heard from moms who have children struggling with mental illness. And although I had my personal experience, I just felt like I needed some more tools in my toolbox. So I decided to enroll in a David Kessler training certification program and became a certified grief educator. And initially, I was thinking that was just going to help me talk to these moms a little bit in a little bit more effective way. But ultimately, what it led me to do was offer online short-term grief groups for bereaved parents, because I feel like that support is so critical. And I pull education into those groups because I know when I learned concepts about grief that put words to things that I had thought and felt, it was just really powerful. That's been a little bit about the journey and the evolution of the book, and then my grief group. And going kind of hand in hand with both of those is I was a former corporate trainer. So I felt like it was a real natural progression to tell our story. And so I have been invited to speak at various organizations to do that. And those talks really center around helping people get to know a little bit about my Max and dealing with mental illness and how it impacts the family, suicide awareness, kind of navigating the stigma and the silence, grief and loss, and then hope and healing. That's just a little bit about my journey since losing Max and kind of what I've done in this grief community since then.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. It's incredible to hear the tenacity and bravery with which you tackled this. But like you, I have to default to, but what choice were you given, right? Because some people say, I don't, that whole cringe phrase of "you're so strong." I don't know how you're doing this. You're so strong, or you're doing amazing. I'm so proud of you. And all I could think inside of me was, if you're proud of me for feeling the way I feel, then you need to know how I really feel, because it just told me how good I was at putting on a mask, how good I was at propping myself up or trying to replicate that whole pulling myself up by the bootstraps, which had worked with other problems in my life. But this wasn't a problem. This was a trauma of unbelievable proportion that, like you, had cracked me at my very center. And so to have people coming at you with "you're so strong," that sounds like your response was those social media posts. It was the people thinking, oh, she's doing great or whatever. They're just wanting to know if you're doing good yet, or are you getting better, all those things. And you thought, here, let me tell you what the inside of this looks like, because it's like I tell people, when we have an accident and we have a physical trauma, people can see our injury or our cast or whatever the case might be, the scar. And there's this natural empathy from them of, oh, and they see it and they accommodate for it. And there's care. With this invisible trauma, all they see is what they see. And so oftentimes we do such a good job at masking it because, let's face it, most of us are not equipped to walk out into the world and just look like on the outside what we feel like on the inside, I don't know how I would do that. One, I don't think I could ever look as bad as I feel, right? There's that. But if we just went out a disheveled mess, then someone's going to throw us in the hospital probably. And so there's no real way to accurately put this out other than your words. Once you switched into putting it together, do you find that how you journaled differed? I'm curious of whether you felt like it changed your journaling at all. Because you said you were still journaling when you originally had the idea for the book.
Yeah. So, no, I just continued to, for that first 18 months, just really journal how I was feeling. And obviously, reading through that and seeing that chronologically laid out in the book, the tone of those journal entries changes very much. At the beginning, you can almost feel the numbness and maybe some of the denial, the shock. And then right around that 12-year mark, you can start to notice the anger.
12-month mark. Yeah.
Yeah. The anger. I dealt with a lot of anger after losing Max. And so that comes out, the loss of hope comes out. I'm a person of faith, and I had a very serious crisis of faith. And so that's why when Sarah said, let's stop the book at 12 months, I thought, oh gosh, no, this would be awful. The tone of those, I continued for those 18 months to just journal about how I was feeling and what I was experiencing. And so some journal entries are about an interaction that I may have had with a person, or a book that I read that really resonated with me, a movie, just things that I was experiencing in those early days of grief. But like I said, the tone throughout the book is very different. And I just remarked recently that there was almost more hope at the beginning, and then no hope in the middle, and then the hope of hope returning at the end. So
it's interesting that you say that, because there is some part of us, and it's the part of us that's so in shock and so covered and protected by this. What becomes known as grief fog feels like a blanket of safety in the beginning, even though we don't realize the amount of safety it's allowing us. But that there is almost that. So, I mean, that's why some people do very bold things in their first year, even though it's not a wise idea. Like in retrospect, I can put that out there. I've talked to enough people that have done things in the first months and weeks afterwards, from nonprofits to big projects to you name it. And they later say that wasn't the wisest thing. But that blanket of protection allows us this false sense of hope. And I say false because it's not true hope in the beginning. It really is blanketed and clouded shock. Because then when, like you said, 12 months is so many people at that point go, oh, good, they've made it. They've made it through their first year. They're okay, whatever. And really, little do they know, our nightmare is just beginning, because that blanket starts to leave, that shock starts to wear off. And I tell people it's like the nerve endings have been exposed. And all of a sudden, it's like we feel the rawness of the permanence of the loss start to creep in. And so when I talk about survival, hope, and healing for the first 3 years, from a chronological standpoint, they kind of go in that order. I have moms sometimes at 12 and 13 months say, this is supposed to be hope. And I say, be clear. This year's going to be really hard, and it's going to be really raw. Hope is going to show up, but it probably won't be in the first half. And to hear you echo that, it just says that while we all have very different aspects to our grief, the overarching similarities are so huge. Like I hear it over and over again. And to hear you be able to even say the hope of hope showed up, but it wasn't early in that second year. I was like, she's just confirming what I say all the time too, which is, you don't get to 13 months and go, great, I'm super hopeful. You're actually, if most moms and loss survivors are fairly hopeless at that point, because you kind of roll into that place of, I think we had so much writing on, if I can just get through this first year. And I don't think it was a conscious thought. Like we didn't think, and then I'll be okay. We weren't consciously thinking that part, but there was a part inside of us that had some hope for that day after 365 days. And when the day after 365 days shows up and it's still there and it's still the same, and you're faced with, now I've got to do this another year, and after that there'll be another year. And then there'll be
Mhm.
that's when that hopelessness starts to set in and you think, what am I going to do with this? Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so to be able to have the bravery to put out your journal entries and how you were feeling, and then thank you to Sarah. I mean, you probably would have done it on your own anyway, it sounds like, but it sounds like she nudged you a little earlier to say, hey, you should think about this. People would really benefit from it. From seeing the cover online, it's beautiful, watercolor, birds. Does it look similar to the bird? Tell me about the actual bird. And does he still show up? Because, well, he wouldn't be alive anymore, but does a version of him still show up?
Yes, I am not a bird nerd. I really didn't
Me
have
either.
any. I really didn't have any interest or knowledge of birds prior to that. We live here in Pittsburgh. We live in a very wooded area, though, and so there's no shortage of birds. And I recognize the big ones like the cardinals and the blue jays and the robins, but this was different. And I think because I've seen the bird again, I think it was a mockingbird,
Mm.
but it made a racket. And for me to even notice it in those first days when I was so in such deep grief and shock, for me to even notice a bird, it had to be doing some pretty impressive noise making
And
and
something out of the
activity.
normal bird activity, right?
Yeah. So no, the bird that Sarah designed doesn't look like a mockingbird. It's very colorful, but she did these 6 renditions of it, and I love them all. But my favorite is one that's called Brown Eyes because my Max had big, beautiful, expressive brown eyes, and I could tell how he was feeling just by looking at his eyes, and his pain was often reflected in them. And the bird that had it's a close up of this beautiful, colorful bird's face with these big brown eyes is just one of my absolute favorites. Yeah.
Well, watercolor and pencil art are two of my favorite mediums. And so I just think it's absolutely breathtaking. I think if I saw right, it's a little square book, which means it's a beautiful little gift book to give a griever. Like you said, I love that you said you were trying to put together something that was easier to read, more digestible, not so heavy. You're right. A lot of the books that are out there are great and they're really heavy for early grief, especially this traumatic of a grief to a mama's heart. And most, not all, but most, I'd say 9 out of 10 moms would say reading challenged them for several years, meaning just the
Mm,
concentration, the focus that it takes, because one little word can take our brain somewhere else. And then we realize we've read a whole paragraph and we're like, what did I just read? Because we've gone
yeah.
down a mental rabbit hole of sorts or just a mental void sometimes, depending on how early it is. But when I put together my early survival guide, all of my books for the early stages are very simple. That's the best word I can
Mm,
have to make it like layman's terms. And early grievers need something that gives them those little glimmers of hope. And it sounds like your book does such a good job at, but also shows them the raw reality of the bad day, like, and just that relatability, which leads to the community aspect. You've gone on, like me, to start a form of a community. Explain what you do for grieving parents, I believe, in your support space.
yeah. So after I got my certification as a grief educator, I was kind of thinking, where is this going to lead me? And I thought maybe I would do some one-on-one peer support. But ultimately, I found myself offering these short-term online grief groups. And part of that was because my husband, Bill, and I, and our son, Sam, and Sam's then girlfriend, now wife, joined a suicide survivor support group about a year in. We didn't even know we needed a suicide survivor support group. But Julia found one. She's just an amazing young woman, full of wisdom and grit. And she found a
That's
support group.
Sam's spouse, right? His wife.
Yeah, yeah. They just got married this past December. So coming up on a year. But anyway, she found this group for us. And it was almost immediately that feel we could feel healing because we were with a group of people who understood. They'd all experienced the same kind of loss. Not everybody had lost a child. Some people had lost a spouse. Obviously, Sam had lost a sibling. But just being with a group of people who understood our loss was so validating and so normalizing because I would say that the primary emotion I felt prior to joining that group was alone. I just felt like nobody understood. I felt like nobody had been through what we had been through. And so I just felt totally alone. And joining that group was so powerful. And so I wanted to then offer that to other people. And so I started to offer these 6-week online groups. And I decided to do short term rather than ongoing, because I think sometimes in early grief, you can't sign up for something that is ongoing. You can only handle a little digestible piece. So that's why I selected the 6-week time frame. And every group starts with a little piece of education. So we might talk about different types of grief. We might talk about the needs of the grieving. We might talk about grief illiteracy and just why it is so darn hard to navigate grief in our culture. And because I know when I learned those things, when I learned those concepts and those terms for things that I had thought or felt, again, it was just so validating. I felt like I felt like there was something wrong with me. And then I learned these grief concepts and realized what I was experiencing and thinking were just the normal, natural reactions to losing someone so beloved. And that was very powerful. So I try to pull that into my grief groups as well. And they are focused on parents. I primarily attract moms because that's who I am, and that's fine. And I just love to see the way the groups come together. I love to see the bond that is built really fairly quickly among the people that participate. And then the support and just the encouragement that they provide to one another is so gratifying. And frankly, it's healing for me too. I just started a new group last week. And so last night was our second session. And there's just such collective wisdom in these groups of people, and talking about the coming up holidays and how we're going to navigate them, and talking about healing resources or practices that we have found or participated in. Again, just so incredibly helpful. And I think I honestly can't say enough about how important I think support groups are in the healing journey. I just think they're really critical. And I'm really gratified to be able to offer that to other grieving parents, because I know how helpful it's been for me.
Yeah, I know. I understand completely. That's why I do what I do. But so when you were talking about the bird, again, things that resonate so much cross over with other moms, but lots of people see birds are a really easy thing for spirit to allow us to turn and look at. They're readily available. Cardinals have always been a thing for us, and it is for a lot of people. Cardinals are a very recognizable bird. They're kind of known to be a carrier of spirit. And I remember my paternal grandma, when I was young, she always had little cardinals around, like figurines, stained glass, things like that. And I remember as a little girl saying, Grandma, why do you have cardinals? Like, why do you like cardinals so much? And she said, and at the time as a little girl, I had no idea how much loss and adversity she had. We don't usually ask although I would think my grandkids know more about it, but we are more open than my grandmother's generation would have been. The closest to that would have been them showing somebody a picture of so-and-so's gravestone, but then you don't talk about that otherwise. And so she just said, when a loved one is near, a cardinal appears, and I have lots of family that I've lost, and it always makes me feel good to think of cardinals. And that thought kind of went away because I was a little girl, and I'm like, oh, okay, that means nothing to me. As I got older, and my grandmother had 4 children, my dad was the youngest of her children. She buried her youngest. She buried her baby. He was 48 years old. And I remember and I was her second oldest grandchild. And I remember at the memorial service looking at my grandma. You talk about their eyes and looking into the depths of people's eyes. And she had tear ducts that didn't work, Erin, but so there weren't tears flowing down her face when we came face to face in the hallway at my mom's house. But she just said, Melissa, this is the worst thing I've ever endured in my life. And I've been through some pretty hard things. And I didn't know all the hard things. I knew she was raised in a farm and was the oldest daughter of 13. But she had seen a lot of hardships. She said, but nothing has prepared me for this. And I remember seeing something gone. I don't know how else to explain it. And the empathy that I had for my grandma from that point until I lost my son never really made sense to me, because I shouldn't have had that empathy at that point, because I had no way to really have it. But I remember even when my mom was struggling, and even when I would say, but my grandma lost her child, like I would, and I wasn't trying to defer my own grief. I just saw the gravity of her grief over mine for reasons that at the time I didn't understand. And so this cardinal thing came back around when for years I felt like it was my other grandma that was kind of a guardian with Alex. And then one day, years after seeing cardinals with Alex, something happened and I suddenly realized, like I almost said out loud, grandma, like I suddenly had that epiphany that it was my other grandma. And of course he was there. She was with Alex. And of course she was showing me cardinals and having Alex show us cardinals. But cardinals, we would have a pair of cardinals while we lived in Florida. We'd seen them a lot in Kansas City. We have one or two friends that still see them a lot and equate them with Alex. When they're talking to him, they'll show up and things like that. But these cardinals that would show up for us in Florida, we have, like you have Emmylou, we have Harper, Alex's dog. And Alex, he would walk Alex's dog every morning. And these cardinals were always waiting for my husband and Harper on the power line, and they would kind of just flit along and fly. Not every single morning, but most of them. And one morning, this is just goes back to something you said. One morning, he said, they're not out there, but I could swear they were. And then it happened the next morning. And I went out there with him, and we realized that there was a dang mockingbird mocking the cardinals. And that's the cardinals have a whistle.
Yeah.
And they were mocking the cardinal sound. And we were thinking, where are the cardinals? Well, the cardinals did show back up. They weren't gone permanently. But that was the first moment that we realized that was Alex's way of kicking things up, because he was such a comedian. Like you said that about Max. Alex wasn't trying to do stand-up. He should have been. He was just a natural stand-up comedian. He commanded rooms. He had antics. He would prefer to make comedy out of things that would make him look, I don't want to say dumb, but dumb. He was very smart. He was an IB graduate, but he would prefer to have comedy be his vehicle versus showcasing his intelligence and stuff. And so in that moment with that mockingbird for 2 days, mom got a laugh, because I was like, okay, Alex, I get it. The Cardinals can come back now. So we just never know. And birds are such a amazing vehicle for us to connect with spirit. Do you have other signs of Max, or are the birds still your primary sign when Max is wanting to say, hey, mom?
The birds, yeah, they're still. I had to have hip surgery this summer. And so we have a big picture window in our family room. So I got the idea of getting a plexiglass bird feeder to mount on the window, that I thought I'll sit here and watch birds during my recovery. Well, I clearly don't know birds. And so I hung it up, and I didn't see one bird for 4 weeks. I was so disgusted. And one morning, I was just having a bad morning after my surgery. And I came down into the family room, and I was feeling very sorry for myself. And I was in pain. And I sat down on the couch, and there was a pair of cardinals that came they were the very first birds that I saw at my bird feeder. And I had seen pairs of cardinals over the course of the last month or so, couple of months really. And we lost my mom in November of last year. The first time I saw this pair of cardinals, I was like, oh, it's my mom and Max letting me know that they're
together.
Because, yeah, Max was my mom's first grandchild. She watched him when I went back to work after he was born. They just had a really special bond. And yeah, I just continue to, and I don't see many mockingbirds here in Pittsburgh. I see a lot of them in Florida. But, it's just those birds. And I just think I have such a greater appreciation for them now than I did prior to losing him. Not only because I feel like they're a sign, but they're beautiful, and they're a source of comfort. And I'm really just very thankful for that sign that I have.
Yeah. It's amazing what this loss can do for our vision and our sight in so many ways. And just the idea that you even said, I never really stopped and thought about or appreciated birds before. Birds are everywhere. They're plentiful. So it's such an easy way for our loved one to nudge us and make us feel loved, like they're here. I do want to talk a little bit just briefly about grief illiteracy, because when we talk about mental health and suicide, I've had lots of conversations over the years about grief and loss. And we think so much about stigma and suicide and mental health stigma. and all of that. But so many people don't realize that there is a stigma surrounding grief in Western culture. There's a real grief illiteracy in our culture. There are other cultures that do a better job than we do of honoring their deceased, celebrating their ancestors, keeping them as an active part of their daily lives and conversations. I have not found that to be true in Western culture. I have found that we expect there to be a timeline. We expect it to have an end. We expect it to be a task to be finished. Speak to your experience in that. Obviously, it's been somewhat the same, but it sounds like me, you set out somewhat, even if it wasn't knowingly, selfishly in the beginning to say, I need to create what I can't find. That was how the podcast was born for me. That's how the grief groups were born for you, to create the space that will serve me as well. So for me, standing on a proverbial milk crate and having hard conversations is one of the ways I try to combat grief illiteracy and help people understand that it's not linear. There is no time frame. Grief is an expression of love for somebody that is no longer here. Therefore, we're not going to really quit grieving. We're going to learn to move forward with this. We're not going to move on, which is a different thing. So I'm going to assume, bad choice of words, but I'm going to guess that you, from the things you've already said, part of why you wanted to do the group and the book and things were to help combat this grief illiteracy that you were finding by how you were being met by other people, and the very thing that put you in a place to put those posts and those journals out on social media. So now that you know all that and you've lived through that and you've put this out in the world, what do you continue to do? Like you talked about speaking. Tell me an example of places that you've spoken and how that's helping grief illiteracy.
Oh gosh, I feel like I could talk for hours about grief illiteracy. And at the beginning, we heard all of the platitudes, right? He's in a better place. He's no longer suffering. At least you had him as long as you did. God
At
needed
least you have another
angel.
child, all the things.
Yes. And I didn't understand why they hit me the way that they did. But, I remember there was a person who I know who gave me a plaque within a couple of weeks of losing Max that said something to the effect of, it's about learning to dance in the rain. And I honestly, when I opened it, wanted to throw it back in her face. I was so angry. And that was my response to many of those comments, and I've learned that the reason I responded that way was because they were minimizing my grief. They were ignoring what I was feeling. You talked about the gravity and enormity of our loss, and those kinds of trite phrases and platitudes just discount that. And so angry about all those things at the beginning. And one of the things that I try to do through my journal entries that I posted online and throughout my book is I try to speak to the grieving person, but I also try to speak to the person who's walking alongside those grieving. And I've gotten that feedback about my book, is that it's been very helpful for clinicians in understanding grief and for friends and family members, someone who's grieving. And so I feel really strongly about that education. And I feel like I do that through the book. I continue to do that through social media and the posts that I have.
Grief illiteracy is just all around us and causes other people to make assumptions about our grief, and it causes us to make assumptions and maybe set false expectations. I know I really felt like I should feel better at that 12-month mark. Mm-hmm. And when the 12-month mark came, and like you said, day 366, and I looked and I thought, oh my gosh, not only do I not feel better, in some ways I feel worse. How am I going to manage this? And a lot of that was just my complete lack of understanding of grief. And so I think educating myself about grief and then helping to educate others is a big part of my passion and meaning now. And I try to do that, like I said, through the book, through the social media, through my talks. And I just did a talk last week. I've spoken at a variety of groups, some churches. I was invited to a law office that had lost a partner to suicide. spoken at a couple of NAMI affiliates and conferences, kind of from the mental illness angle. But last week I gave a talk at a local library, and there was a variety of people that attended. And so it's really interesting to me that my talk hits people where they are. So sometimes they have experience with mental illness, either themselves or in their family. So when I talk about having a family member in Max who struggled with mental illness, that speaks to them. Some people have been touched by suicide. So when I talk about losing Max to suicide and the stigma and just facing that portion of the talk speaks to them. And then other people are just grieving a loss, maybe the loss of a child, maybe the loss of somebody else. And so when I talk about grief being love with nowhere to go, you used that phrase earlier. Mm-hmm. I talk about our culture treating grief like a problem to be solved. I talk about how the stages of grief are not linear, and we can feel all of those emotions in the same day, frankly, and we'll cycle through them again and again. So I just feel like that my talk hits people where they are, and there is not only the intent to share my story through my talks, but my intent to educate about all of those things, about mental illness, suicide, loss and grief, and then hope and healing. Because you mentioned earlier, when we're in the early stages of grief and we've lost our hope, we don't see a way that it's going to come back. We can't fathom a point where we're going to have our hope back. And so hearing about how someone else has navigated that journey does provide some hope and healing for people. And so I try to incorporate all of those things when I'm speaking to a group of people, because I think they're all really important and things that as a culture we typically don't talk about.
Yeah, I don't know why we've taken that out of our culture, but it's just a symptom of the culture that we've created, I guess, right? The fast-paced, ever-present. We're also, more so than most places in the world, we live more segregated than many. We have these big houses that we don't generally live with extended family, although we've seen COVID change some of that. But we generally have lots of land and we want our neighbors to stay over there. And it's the opposite of the way we used to community. If you're gonna, and so the way that when you live in community with people, it becomes more natural. And I will tell you that one of the things that struck me from your book is that it seems like to me that you had a fairly good example in your church community fairly early on of how community really can come in and wrap around you and be there as support, be there to, dare I say, distract you a little bit, which then forces you to, like you said, do things to like get out of bed, get dressed, eat, that you might not do if people weren't around. Well, that's the beauty. So while there's a portion of you that's like, could they just go away? It's in your best interest that they're there at that time, that the community is showing up and saying, eat and have you slept and go take a nap. And you didn't appreciate it in the time, but to hear you retrospectively talk about how important that was to you. And you also spoke about a crisis of faith. How has that evolved for you? Because you're not alone. Many people listening have experienced that or are experiencing that crisis of faith. Some come back, some go a different route. Where has that landed for you? Because obviously you had tremendous support in your community of faith. And then you went through a faith crisis. Talk a little bit about that as we get close to winding things up, if you don't mind, because I think it's interesting and it's something a lot of people will relate to.
Yeah. So the first thing is I did not know that it was common for people to come to our home when we lose a loved one. I didn't know that was customary. But
because luckily you probably had no basis for knowing that.
Exactly. And so anyway, our pastors from our church were a couple of the first people that arrived. And the two pieces of advice they gave us was the people who love you are going to want to show up, and let them. And then the second thing they said is God can handle anything you throw at him. And I'm so thankful for both of those pieces of advice, because we did allow people into our home for the first couple of weeks, and it frankly was life-saving. And then the throwing anything at God. So I am a person of faith, and I prayed for my Max daily for 8 years while he struggled with his mental illness. And I prayed for healing. every day. He was on prayer lists of probably 100 people. That's not an exaggeration. We had prayer gatherings in our home. He struggled with both major depressive disorder and also epilepsy. So 2 disorders of the brain. And there was always that fear that he would either hurt himself or that he would be hurt inadvertently from having a seizure. And then I remember a time walking through my neighborhood where I really felt the Lord say to me, he's going to be okay. And of course, I thought that meant he was going to be okay here in this world. I thought he's going to be healed. He's going to have this tremendous story of restoration and healing and redemption that he's going to be able to share with the world. When he died, I remember thinking, this is not the way this story was supposed to end. And so I felt betrayed. I felt abandoned. And I was...
You told me he's going to be okay.
Yes. Yes. And I was really angry with God. And I was angry for a long time. And I continued to go through some of the motions. We continued to stay engaged with our faith community. We continued to go to church. I even continued some Bible studies, albeit a little bit lackadaisical, to be honest. But where I sit now, 4 years later, there are so many, I'm going to call them God moments. Some people call them whispers from heaven, that it is really unrecognizable to think that God wasn't with me through the whole thing. Just the fact that I had a therapist that I was established with prior to losing Max, that I could continue with within 2 weeks of losing him, was providential. My husband and I had a marriage therapist, and my Lord, that man has been a godsend, because when a couple loses a child, it can cause a very big wedge to come between them. And so that was providential. The bird was a little sign, I think, a little whisper from heaven. And there have just been so many examples of God's presence and provision that they're undeniable. I can't look back and say, he did abandon me. He did betray me. I mean, my story didn't end the way I wanted it to end. And I can also say that he's been with me throughout it. And so it's been a journey. It's been a journey back. And I wouldn't even say that I'm back completely, but I'm continuing to work towards it. And I'm continuing to allow my heart to trust God a little bit more every year. And I anticipate that will be part of my journey for the rest of my life. I never thought that my relationship with God was transactional. I'll do this and I expect you to do that. But looking back, there was a little bit of that in my prayers. God, I'm going to pray faithfully for my son every day, so I expect you to keep him safe.
Right.
And so it's been a real journey. And there have been people that he has placed in my life, friends, sometimes strangers, that have really reminded me of God's presence. And I'm very grateful for that. And songs that I hear that really speak to my heart, my grieving mother's heart, all of those things have sort of combined to help me realize that even though I felt alone, I wasn't. I never have been. It's kind of like that. I don't know if you're familiar with that Footprints poem and an image, but God has been with me and carrying me through these years, even when I didn't recognize that he was or really even want him to be him. He's been with me, and I'm thankful for that.
Yeah, I love hearing you say that, because so many people will relate and understand. And even if you're not a person of faith, even if God isn't your center point, I do know one person that would say that they feel devoid of belief in anything. They believed that prior to the loss of their child, so it wasn't something that came about as a part of that. But I think their battle with faith of any kind has continued to wage since the loss of their child. But even people that don't necessarily believe in God, but believe in, I'm a very spiritual person. I'm not religious. I wasn't raised in religion, and consequently don't necessarily have that faith myself. But I feel like I'm a person of great faith in the universe, faith in something beyond us that is greater. And without that belief that there is a greater power of some sort that's at work, that determines our path, that keeps us feeling safe, I don't know what people do without some belief of that in some way. And I think sometimes we maybe split hairs over the words that we choose to put on it as humans. Maybe our belief systems aren't not as far off as we think. It's a matter of the verbiage that we use sometimes. But I think you talking about that being a struggle is so relevant because especially moms, where when our child who's a part of us is taken from us, the betrayal of that feels huge. This wasn't the way it was supposed to be. I even kind of shared that with you when I said my husband had recognized something recently with how I was helping people. And I said, yeah, but this isn't what I was supposed to do. Now I say that, and out of the other side of my mouth now in my journey, a part of me can say and believe this is what I was meant to do. And I hate that. On some level, I have come to, I don't really love the word acceptance. It has a place, but I don't really find Alex's death will ever be acceptable to me. That doesn't mean I don't understand that it's real. But for me, there is a level of acceptance that has come with this was Alex's path, and it was always meant to be a part of our path together. Reckoning with that is going to be a lifelong journey.
Yep.
Until I see him again, until we're reunited again. And then I guess I can say, so how'd I do? Because I was listening the best I could, and I was trying to bring your beautiful soul and light into this the best I could. That's one of my biggest challenges. I'm sure you feel that sometimes about, am I doing Max justice? I feel that because everything I do is with him and in his honor. It is to help other people. It's to help myself. But it also is in his honor and to continue the work. We both feel that our kids were such gifts to the world. That's what most moms feel, right? And that not only did they miss their life, but so many people miss them being in this life. This is the only version of that we have left. And I've come to believe that as much as I want to kick and rail against it as his mother, if I was outside of my own bubble, I could say, but his purpose is greater now than it would have been if he had lived. And that's hard. That's a hard pill to swallow as a mom. As a realist, someone who's more stoic in her belief, that's been my hardest pill to swallow as someone who generally defaults to rationale and logic. And there's nothing rational or logic about losing our child.
Amen. Yep.
And so that battle will be waged on and off inside myself forever. However, I do believe in my soul that this was our intended work, and I hate it. and I hope that's taken in the vein it's meant. It doesn't mean I hate talking to everyone. It doesn't mean I hate the podcast. I love what I do, and I hate the reason I have to do it. I hope that's clear. So I was like, as soon as I said that, I'm like, if somebody takes that wrong, I feel so bad. I didn't mean it that way at all. But it is such a duality to be doing what feels like a call. I've never used the word calling as someone who's not of a God faith, but I don't have any other word to use, Erin. This is a calling for me to do this work. And I was a chef who loved what I did, had always aspired to be a chef and briefly tried to go a different direction and then got pulled back to it. That didn't feel like a calling. That was just a love. I just loved it. Something I enjoyed. This is a calling, which is different.
Yeah. I love that you said everything you do is to honor Alex, because I feel the same way about Max. And the very best feedback I get when somebody reads my book is, I didn't know Max, but your book helped me fall in love with him. Yeah. And what better feedback can I as his mom get? Because he was an incredible human being. And I wish more people had known him here on earth. Yeah.
And so that book helps them know him a little bit. And in a legacy piece, it carries that on.
Yeah. And I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for that. And like you, I start all my grief groups off that way. I make everybody introduce themselves because I think it's important for us to get to know each other and to get to know the name of our child that we've lost. And I always say, I'm Erin. We lost our Max in June of 2020. And if you had told me 5-6 years ago, this is what I would be doing, I don't know if I would have laughed or smacked you, because who wants to be doing this? Who wants to be in this grief community because we've lost a child? Nobody.
Yep.
And so it's a calling. It's that David Kessler has come up with the 6th stage of grief called meaning. And that's not finding meaning in the death of our loved one, because we never will, but it's finding
Right.
meaning in our own lives.
Right.
And that is, I'm very grateful that I have found that meaning. And this is my passion and my purpose and my meaning now. And it's because of Max.
I get it. So I know that you have your book. I know that you're a speaker. I know that you have your groups. What's next for Erin, Max's mom?
Well, I'm just really hoping to, first of all, with the book, I just recently re-released it as an ebook. And so
awesome.
up until now, it's only been available as a paperback. Just a couple of weeks ago, it was released on Amazon in the Kindle version. And I'm also looking to distribute it through other book distributors. So to make it just more accessible as to the Nook, to iBooks, that sort of thing. So there's just continuing marketing and tweaking of the book, because I so firmly believe that it is a helpful resource for grieving moms, for people that are walking alongside the grieving, and even, like I said, for clinicians to better understand the grief that a mom feels. I want to continue to expand my speaking. I feel really passionate about that, about sharing my story, and about continuing to educate others and elevate the conversation about the important topics of mental illness, suicide, loss and grief, hope and healing. So I'm really focused on that. And I have some ideas for future books. Maybe turning my book, because it was written as journal entries, maybe turning it into some sort of guided journal for others, and maybe just writing other stories about other people's losses, maybe other moms' losses, because those grieving moms are really my heart. I just, like you, the minute that we meet, there's a bond, because we've experienced the same loss and we understand each other. And that's just so powerful. So, yeah, those are just some things. And obviously continue my grief groups.
Thank you for sharing all of that. Thank you for sharing all that with us. I'll be excited to watch as you go forward in this journey and to see what's next for you. And who knows? So I'm going to look forward to seeing you as you go through this evolution and the next things that are for you. And who knows, maybe you'll be back and we can talk about what's happened and where you're at in a couple of years from now. Because as my experience has been, as these things organically grow and as our sons show us what the next step is, it's not always, as you indicated earlier, what we thought it might be. I'll be interested to see where that goes and feel honored to be walking beside you, even though we wish that we didn't have the reason. Do you mind sharing a message of hope as we end for other moms and or other lost survivors that are listening?
I guess just that in those early days of grief, when it's so deep and it's so dark, you can't ever imagine a time when you'll feel better. And you mentioned this earlier, and I think it bears repeating, that our grief never goes away. We never get over it. But over time, I do believe if we process it productively, if we feel our feelings, and if we work on our grief, because that old adage, time heals all wounds, is not correct. As time goes on, we can just become bitter. So it's important to process our grief. But I think that as we do that, and as time goes on, our grief gets easier to carry. We're always going to carry it because we loved our children so deeply. But hopefully that grief, as time goes on, isn't so all-encompassing. It isn't so overwhelming. It's not so deep and so dark. It just gets a little easier to carry. And my prayer and my hope for everybody is that they do gain that hope and they do find some meaning in life again, even if that's something as simple as enjoying a hobby that they used to enjoy, like gardening or painting, or enjoying sunsets, enjoying nature. I think that finding some meaning in life is so important following our loss, and it is possible. So that is my hope and my prayer for other grieving moms, is that's what they'll find.
Well, thanks, Erin. I appreciate you sharing that. I appreciate you being here. Thank you for the connection. I will put all of the places to find you in the show notes, but if you were to verbally tell people where to find you, where would that be?
It would be my website. My website is erinblechman.com. And it has information about my book, my grief groups, my speaking. You can sign up for my newsletter and email notifications about upcoming events and groups. So that's really probably the best way, kind of a one-stop shop for everything.
Okay, awesome. That will be in the show notes, but so will links to all the other spaces. If they wanted to just say hop straight to Instagram, they could. We'll talk about this once we get off recording, but they will also be able to find you on my resources page as well. So there'll be several places. Thank you so much. This has been so amazing, and I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you. Right back at you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Have a great day, and we will talk soon, ma'am.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Grievers, it is my hope that from today you will take that which serves you and simply leave the rest. I would love to connect with you, and the best way to do that is to start out on my website, where the first thing you'll find is a video recorded message from me. And then from there, you can find everything I offer: the online Zoom support groups, the books I've written, ways to connect for the podcast, and an entire resource library assembled to help all suicide loss grievers find the resources that they need to help them along their healing journey. Please go to theleftoverpieces.com. From there, I hope that we can connect, and I hope that you too can discover that we truly are better together. If anything that you've heard in today's episode resonates with you, I would ask that you please subscribe to get notified every week of my new episodes. And then take a moment to rate and review me on Apple Podcasts so that more grievers like us can find this podcast and this community. It is from my own experience of finding myself sitting amid the leftover pieces of my own shattered heart that I can tell you that while it seems impossible in the early days, it is possible to put those pieces back together and be okay again. And every week, we'll be right here providing more comfort, hope, and community. So until next week, I'll sign off today with some words from one of my Alex's favorites, Peter Pan. Never say goodbye, because goodbye means going away, and going away means forgetting. Grievers, no one here's forgetting. Talk soon.